Thank you very much, Professor Muni, and may I at the beginning congratulate Pramod and NICE for organizing such a big event. I've been associated with NICE in the past, and it's very good to see uh, how such a complex event involving so many speakers is being organized so well. Uh, uh, Time is brief, and I thought I would share some thoughts with regard to our neighborhood and touch a little bit about one country which is a critical part of our neighborhood, which is Pakistan. But the first question, really, to take off from what Professor Muni and Dr. Gupta had spoken about, which is about this question of neighborhood first versus India first. The fact is, we live in an age where there are massive changes taking place, in particular because of the rise of China, but also the larger disruptions which have taken place, and people have spoken about the end of the era of globalization and a beginning of an era of deglobalization. The point is that we live in an age of enhanced nationalism. And although the world that we live in is much more interdependent, nevertheless, the rise of nationalism is a factor which cannot be discounted in any country or in any region. So the first question when one talks about our neighborhood or thinks about our neighborhood is what constitutes national interest in an age of nationalism. And I will leave these as questions, but it's something which I think about often when we look at South Asia, given the extent of securitization of relationships which have taken place in South Asia in the past 2 or 3 decades. So the first question which comes to mind is to what extent is national interest composed or made up of national security? Is national security the whole of national interest? Now, this is a question which in Pakistan they have grappled with not very successfully for many decades now. But generally, what Pakistan's experience shows is the weaknesses of identifying national security wholly with national interest. The second question which comes to mind is whether national interest the same as national prestige? And this is again a question which we grapple with in South Asia in particular, but also elsewhere in the world. That does national prestige imply the same thing as national interest, or is national interest something more than that? And again, we have to look at how we define national interest in an age of excessive securitization of relationships. I'll return to this very briefly in the end if there's time, but let me touch a little bit about India-Pakistan relations in the present context. Now, it is well known that relations between neighbors can often be very difficult, and India-Pakistan relations are not an exception. There are many other examples of this around the world, and certainly in our region in Asia, we have to look at the example of Japan and China, where again, very complex, deeply divisive historical issues which continue to suck so much oxygen out of the room in contemporary Japan-China relations. So India-Pakistan relations, because of differences which cannot be reconciled and will never be reconciled, have followed a crests and troughs pattern. In the foreseeable future, this crests and troughs pattern will continue, an up and down relationship. And we are in the midst of a transition point in this crests and troughs relationship. People who think that a downward spiral is going to continue to be downward for all times to come are as mistaken as those who think that when relations are on upswing, there will never be a downswing. The upswings and downswings are inevitable in India-Pakistan relations, as they are in other relationships between where there are difficulties in of history, of politics, of territorial issues which cannot be easily reconciled in other countries in the world. The challenge for diplomacy really is how do you dampen this up and down relation to reduce the extent of the downswing and use the upswings to prepare better for the downswings that will follow. That really is the challenge for Indian and Pakistani diplomacy, and it is an open question to what extent this up and down diplomacy has been successful in dampening these upswings and downswings. The question also really is that when we have a relationship which is prone to these upswings and downswings, what is the role of governments? And I think this is a critical point because a lot depends on the choices which are exercised by either government, given the kind of relationship which you are predisposed to. Now, very clearly in a neighborhood situation, your relations have to be based on realism and on strategic realities. And therefore, in India-Pakistan relations, security and military-related strategic issues will always have a very major role. But exercising the right choices and when you are looking ahead also means that you see how can you desecuritize so heavily securitized a relationship. Now, this is not new. This is something which has been attempted for at least 50, 60 years. How do you introduce non-security elements into a difficult relationship? And there are many ingredients of desecuritization which have been attempted, some with greater success, some with lesser success. I think the challenge before India-Pakistan relations in the future is that how do you introduce non-security elements, how do you desecuritize while being mindful of all the strategic and security related realities within which this relationship is going to be circumscribed. Now, this is a particularly apt moment to reflect on this issue, given the scale of the pandemic and the realities it has forced us to confront. And therefore, when we talk about national interest, I don't think it is possible realistically in India to talk about national interest without looking at social and economic factors much more candidly than we have in the past. How can you have national security without health security or without a greater spread of greater improvement in your overall social indicators in terms of education, access to social infrastructure, etc. This morning, we heard Suresh Prabhuji talking about climate change. Can you realistically expect to make a difference to climate change issues in India without improving your overall education and literacy and health profiles? Can you expect to fight a pandemic without people being sufficiently empowered with knowledge to realize the problems which pandemics, the reasons why pandemics come about? Can you deal with issues of water security without improving the overall social infrastructure in the country? And I think these questions, when we reflect upon them in India, really also are a kind of reflection on our relations with our neighbors in South Asia. And there, I think desecuritization is really the critical element when we look at our national security or indeed our national interest. One final point, and I'll just mention it as a bullet point because my time is almost up, which is about SARC. I don't think we should overlook the narrative value which SARC has in South Asia. And while we can, at a technical level, in terms of meeting targets, improvise our way through sub-regional arrangements, I do think it is India's responsibility and also India's role to think about the narrative value of SARC in South Asia as a whole. Thank you very much.